When Jake and Sarah moved into their new apartment, they were thrilled. After years of saving and living in cramped spaces, they finally had a place they could call their own. The building was in a quiet neighborhood, and the apartment was spacious with large windows that let in plenty of sunlight. The couple loved everything about it, except for the neighbor downstairs. From the moment they moved in, the downstairs neighbor was a problem. It started with loud music blaring late at night. At first, Jake and Sarah assumed it was just a one-time thing, maybe a housewarming party or a gathering. But the noise didn't stop. Almost every night, they were kept awake by the sound of music, stomping, and loud voices coming from the apartment below. Jake decided to go down and talk to the neighbor. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. After a few minutes, he gave up and went back upstairs. The next day, the noise continued. Frustrated, Sarah called the building manager, who promised to talk to the neighbor and resolve the issue. But things didn't get better. In fact, they got worse. A week after moving in, Sarah began having nightmares. Every night she dreamt of someone standing outside their apartment door, knocking incessantly. But when she opened the door, no one was there. In the dreams, the knocking would grow louder and louder until it became unbearable, waking her up in a cold sweat. Jake wasn't sleeping well either. The noise from downstairs was relentless, and every time he tried to confront the neighbor, no one answered. It was as if the apartment below them was empty, yet the noise persisted. On several occasions, Jake pounded on the door in frustration, but there was never a response. One night, Sarah woke up to the sound of knocking, but this time, it wasn't in her dream. It was real. Someone was knocking on their apartment door. She nudged Jake awake, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jake listened for a moment, but the knocking had stopped. "Probably just the pipes or something," he mumbled, rolling over and going back to sleep. But Sarah knew what she had heard. Someone had been outside their door. As the days went on, strange things began happening in the apartment. Lights flickered, objects moved on their own, and the air felt thick with an unseen presence. Sarah often felt like she was being watched, even when she was alone in the apartment. One afternoon, while Jake was at work, Sarah decided to investigate the noise from downstairs herself. She knocked on the neighbor's door, but like Jake, she received no answer. Frustrated, she pressed her ear against the door and listened. She could hear faint music and the sound of someone walking around inside. But when she knocked again, the noises stopped. It was as if whoever was inside knew she was there and was deliberately ignoring her. Feeling unnerved, Sarah returned to their apartment. As she was about to close the door, she noticed something strange. A small piece of paper had been slipped under the door while she was gone. She picked it up and unfolded it, revealing a crudely written note. "Stay away from the neighbor downstairs." Sarah's heart raced as she read the note. Who had written it? And why? Determined to get to the bottom of things, Jake and Sarah decided to do some research. They asked around the building, trying to find out more about their mysterious neighbor. Most of the other tenants didn't know much about him. They said he was a quiet man who kept to himself and rarely interacted with anyone. But one elderly woman who had lived in the building for decades had a different story. "He's not your average neighbor," she whispered when Jake and Sarah asked her about him. "That man downstairs? He's trouble. I don't know why the landlord keeps him around, but strange things have been happening ever since he moved in. People hear noises, see shadows, feel like they're being watched. It's like he brings a darkness with him." Jake and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances. Could their neighbor really be the cause of all the strange occurrences in their apartment? That night, Sarah's nightmares grew more vivid. In her dreams, the knocking on the door was louder, more insistent, and this time, when she opened the door, she saw a shadowy figure standing in the hallway. Its eyes glowed red, and it whispered her name, sending chills down her spine. She woke up screaming, and Jake had to calm her down. But as she tried to shake off the nightmare, she realized something terrifying. The knocking hadn't just been in her dream, it was real. The next day, Jake decided enough was enough. He went downstairs and pounded on the neighbor's door, determined to get answers. To his surprise, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit, cluttered apartment. The air inside was heavy, and there was a strange metallic smell. "Hello?" Jake called out, stepping inside cautiously. There was no response. The apartment looked like it hadn't been lived in for months. Dust covered the furniture and there were no signs of anyone living there. Yet the noise had been coming from this apartment night after night. As Jake walked further into the apartment, he noticed something strange on the wall, a series of photographs. They were pictures of him and Sarah, taken from outside their apartment window. Some of the photos were recent, while others looked like they had been taken months ago. Jake's stomach churned as he realized they had been watched this entire time. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. Jake spun around, but before he could react, something hit him hard on the back of the head, and everything went black. When Jake didn't return after several hours, Sarah began to worry. She called his phone, but there was no answer. Panic set in, and she decided to go downstairs to look for him. As she reached the neighbor's apartment, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, calling out for Jake. The apartment was eerily quiet, and the air felt thick with dread. As she moved through the dimly lit space, she noticed the same photographs on the wall, pictures of her and Jake, taken from their apartment. Suddenly, she heard a faint groan coming from the back of the apartment. Sarah rushed toward the sound and found Jake lying on the floor, unconscious but alive. She quickly helped him to his feet, and together they stumbled out of the apartment. As they made their way back to their own apartment, they heard footsteps behind them. Slow, deliberate footsteps that echoed through the hallway. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. The neighbor was following them. They locked the door behind them, but the knocking began almost immediately. It was loud, insistent, and relentless, just like in Sarah's nightmares. The couple huddled together, terrified, as the knocking grew louder and louder. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The police arrived shortly after, but when they searched the neighbor's apartment, they found nothing. The apartment was empty, and there was no sign of the man who had been living there. Jake and Sarah moved out the next day, but even after they left, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. Moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start for Rachel and her family. Their new home was perfect. Tree-lined streets, well-kept gardens, and friendly neighbors who waved as they passed by. It was everything Rachel had dreamed of after years of living in the chaotic city. The house itself was charming, a 2-story brick home with a wraparound porch and a spacious backyard. Rachel and her husband, Matt, settled in quickly, unpacking boxes and decorating their new space. Their children, Lily and Ben, were excited to have their own rooms and a neighborhood full of kids to play with. Everything seemed perfect, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It started as a faint sensation, a tingle on the back of her neck whenever she was in the backyard or standing at the window. At first, she brushed it off, blaming it on nerves or the stress of the move, but then she began noticing things. Across the street, in the house directly opposite theirs, there was a man. He was always there, sitting on his porch, standing in his front yard, or leaning against his fence, staring at their house. At first, Rachel thought he was just curious about the new neighbors, but as days turned into weeks, his presence became more unsettling. He never waved or smiled. He just watched. It was subtle at first. She'd catch glimpses of him through the curtains or see him when she was playing with the kids outside. But over time, his watching became more frequent. It didn't matter what time of day it was, morning, afternoon, or late at night. He was always there, always watching. Rachel mentioned it to Matt, but he wasn't concerned. "He's probably just lonely," Matt said, shrugging it off. "Old guys like that don't have much else to do. I'm sure he's harmless." But Rachel wasn't so sure. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Rachel decided to sit on the porch and enjoy the quiet. The summer evening was warm, and the sound of crickets filled the air. As she sipped her tea, she glanced across the street and saw him, the man, standing in his driveway, staring directly at her. A chill ran down her spine. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't talking, moving, or interacting with anyone. He was just standing there, his eyes locked on her, unblinking, as if he were waiting for something. Rachel quickly got up and went inside, her heart racing. She locked the door behind her and peered through the window, but he hadn't moved. He was still standing there watching. Over the next few days, Rachel tried to ignore the man's constant presence. She busied herself with household chores and avoided looking out the window. But it wasn't long before things started escalating. One morning, while Matt was at work and the kids were at school, Rachel decided to take the trash out. As she stepped outside, she heard a voice behind her. "Good morning?" Rachel jumped, startled by the sound. She turned to see the man standing at the edge of his yard, his hands in his pockets, staring at her with an eerie smile on his face. Good morning," she replied awkwardly, quickly dropping the trash bag into the bin. "You're new here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've lived in this neighborhood a long time." Rachel nodded, uncomfortable. She didn't want to engage in conversation, but she didn't want to be rude either. "Well, it's a nice place," she said, taking a step back toward the house. The man took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Be careful," he said, his smile fading. "Not everything is as it seems." With that, he turned and walked back toward his house, leaving Rachel standing frozen in the driveway, her heart pounding in her chest. Rachel's unease grew after that encounter. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her more closely now, as if he had some sort of fixation on her. She tried to avoid being outside alone, but every time she went out, there he was, lurking nearby, staring at her with that same unsettling intensity. One night, after putting the kids to bed, Rachel heard a noise outside. It was faint, like someone walking around the yard. She looked out the window and saw nothing but shadows. Still, the unease lingered, and she couldn't help but check the locks on all the doors and windows before heading to bed. A few nights later, the noises returned, but this time they were louder, footsteps coming from the backyard. Rachel's heart raced as she crept to the window and peeked outside. In the dim light, she saw a figure standing near the fence, the man from across the street. He was in their yard. Rachel's hands shook as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. But before the operator could answer, the man disappeared into the shadows, leaving no trace behind. When the police arrived, they found nothing. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing to indicate that anyone had been in the yard. They told Rachel it was probably a neighborhood kid playing a prank and reassured her that she was safe. But Rachel knew better. The man wasn't just watching anymore. He was stalking her. The next morning, Rachel found a package on her doorstep. It wasn't unusual for deliveries to arrive, but this package was different. It had no return address, and the handwriting on the label was unfamiliar. Curious but cautious, Rachel opened the package and gasped. Inside was a small, intricately carved wooden figurine, a replica of her house. Every detail was perfect, from the porch swing to the flowers in the garden. But there was one addition that sent a chill down Rachel's spine. Standing on the porch of the figurine was a small, shadowy figure, a man, staring out at the street, just like the neighbor had been watching her. Rachel immediately called Matt, who came home from work to inspect the package. He was as unnerved as she was, but tried to remain calm. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," he said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. But Rachel knew it wasn't a coincidence. The man was sending her a message. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the house made her jump, and she kept imagining the man sneaking around outside, waiting for the right moment to strike. At around 3 a.m., she heard it, a soft click, followed by the sound of footsteps inside the house. Rachel's heart stopped. She nudged Matt awake, whispering that someone was in the house. They both grabbed their phones and crept out of bed, making their way quietly toward the kids' rooms. The footsteps were getting louder, moving through the downstairs hallway. Rachel's mind raced. How had the man gotten inside? Had he been watching them all this time, waiting for the perfect moment? Just as they reached the kids' rooms, they heard the sound of glass shattering downstairs. Matt rushed to call the police while Rachel locked herself in the children and Ben's room, her heart pounding in her chest. Minutes felt like hours as they waited for the police to arrive. The footsteps moved closer, echoing through the house. Rachel held her breath, praying that they would leave before the intruder found them. When the police arrived, they found the back door wide open and signs of a forced entry, but the intruder was gone. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but found no trace of the man. For days after the break-in, Rachel and her family lived in fear. The man had disappeared, but the feeling of being watched never left. Rachel knew he was still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to return. One evening, as Rachel sat on the porch, watching the sunset, she glanced across the street. The man's house was dark, the windows boarded up. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. But Rachel knew better. The man hadn't left. He was still watching, waiting in the shadows for his next move. The nightmare was far from over. Emily and Matt had finally found the house of their dreams. After months of searching, they discovered a beautiful, old Victorian-style home on a quiet street. The house had everything they wanted: a large backyard, spacious rooms, and an inviting front porch. It was perfect for starting their new life together. From the moment they moved in, they fell in love with the place. The neighborhood was peaceful, and the neighbors seemed friendly. Everything felt just right. But there was one thing that unsettled Emily from the very beginning: their next-door neighbor. The house next door belonged to an elderly man named Mr. Whitman. He lived alone and rarely left his house. Emily often saw him standing by his front window staring out at their house. At first, she thought he was just an old man who enjoyed people watching. But as the days went on, his constant presence at the window became unnerving. No matter the time of day or night, whenever Emily looked out her window, Mr. Whitman was there watching. His eyes followed her every move, and it gave her the creeps. She mentioned it to Matt, but he brushed it off, saying the old man was probably lonely. Emily tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger every day. As the weeks passed, Emily noticed more strange behavior from Mr. Whitman. He never spoke to them or came over to introduce himself like the other neighbors had. Instead, he simply stared from his window, day and night. Emily tried to wave at him once, hoping to break the ice, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on her. It wasn't just the staring that bothered Emily. She started noticing odd things happening around the house. One morning, she found the gate to their backyard wide open, even though she was certain she had closed it the night before. Another time, their trash cans were knocked over, but there was no sign of animals or wind. And then there were the footprints. One evening, after a heavy rainstorm, Emily noticed muddy footprints leading from the sidewalk to the side of their house. The prints were large and distinct, as if someone had been standing outside their window watching them. When she showed them to Matt, he dismissed it, saying it was probably a delivery person or someone passing by. But Emily wasn't convinced. The feeling of being watched grew more intense. She started closing the curtains in every room, but even then she couldn't shake the sensation that Mr. Whitman was always there, lurking just out of sight. One afternoon, Emily decided she couldn't take it anymore. She was determined to confront Mr. Whitman and find out why he was always watching them. She marched over to his house and knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing Mr. Whitman standing in the doorway. His expression was blank, and his eyes, as always, were cold and unblinking. "Can I help you?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice. Emily hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've noticed you watching us," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't mean to be rude, but it's making me uncomfortable. Is there something you need?" Mr. Whitman didn't respond right away. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You should mind your own business," he finally said. "You don't know what's going on in this neighborhood." Emily was taken aback by his response. "What do you mean?" The old man stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "There are things you don't understand, things that have been happening in this house for years. If I were you, I'd be careful." Before Emily could say anything else, Mr. Whitman slammed the door in her face, leaving her standing on the porch, shaken and confused. That night, Emily couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Whitman's cryptic warning. What did he mean by things happening in their house? She had always felt uneasy since moving in, but she had chalked it up to adjusting to a new home. But now she wasn't so sure. The strange occurrences continued. One evening, Emily was home alone while Matt was working late. As she sat in the living room, she heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. She glanced over, expecting to see tree branches swaying in the wind, but there was nothing there. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. Emily's heart raced as she slowly walked over to the window. She pulled back the curtain and gasped. Mr. Whitman was standing outside, staring up at her, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlight. His expression was blank, but his eyes were intense, filled with something she couldn't quite place. Fear, anger, desperation. Emily quickly closed the curtain and backed away from the window, her hands trembling. She grabbed her phone and called Matt, her voice shaking as she told him what had happened. "I'm on my way home," Matt said, his voice filled with concern. "Just stay inside and lock the doors." Emily did as he said, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. Something wasn't right about Mr. Whitman. She felt like he knew something about the house, about them. The next morning, Matt and Emily decided to take matters into their own hands. They began researching the history of their house and the neighborhood, hoping to find some clue about what Mr. Whitman had been referring to. What they discovered was chilling. The house next door, where Mr. Whitman lived, had a dark history. Decades ago, a family had lived there, a couple with 2 young children. One night, the mother and children disappeared without a trace, leaving the father, Mr. Whitman, behind. He was never charged with any crime, but rumors swirled that he had been involved in their disappearance. Over the years, neighbors reported strange occurrences, much like the ones Emily and Matt had been experiencing. Some claimed to see shadowy figures in the windows, while others heard strange noises in the middle of the night. The house had a reputation for being cursed, and many believed that the spirits of Mr. Whitman's family still lingered, watching, waiting. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she read the old newspaper articles. Was it possible that the strange things happening in their home were connected to the events next door? Could Mr. Whitman be involved? That night, Emily and Matt decided to confront Mr. Whitman one last time. They couldn't live in fear any longer. They marched over to his house, determined to get answers. But when they arrived, they found the front door slightly ajar. The house was eerily quiet, and the air inside felt heavy, as if something terrible had happened. They called out for Mr. Whitman, but there was no response. As they ventured further into the house, they discovered a hidden room in the basement, filled with old photographs and belongings that had once belonged to Mr. Whitman's wife and children. And then they saw it, a portrait of the family, with one disturbing detail. The faces of the wife and children had been scratched out, leaving only Mr. Whitman's face untouched. Suddenly they heard footsteps behind them. They turned around to see Mr. Whitman standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with rage. "You should have left it alone," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Now you've brought them back." Before they could react, the room was filled with a cold, oppressive presence. The lights flickered, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them. Emily and Matt felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were being watched by something unseen. In the chaos, they managed to escape the house, but not without hearing Mr. Whitman's final words echoing in their minds. "They'll never leave you alone now."